Hey everyone, thanks for anyone who's turned up today. Today we are going to carry on with our startup idea. So anybody who tuned in last time or the time before that, I believe I could probably show you this easily. Here we go, let's just drop that in there. So we are building a startup, and if you look on the screen, you can see a GitHub repo there. It's all going to be hosted up in there. It's open source. Feel free to have a play. So we're building a fictional startup from scratch. We're starting from absolute nothing at all, and we're going to be building this kind of podcast aggregate system, basically. So basically, the idea here is that as a podcast author, I can add a link to my feed, and it can start being pulled into this system. A little bit like how Spotify or Apple Music or Google Podcasts works. But we can add some extra functionality within it so people can follow and subscribe, and there's kind of like this gated area. So if you're a subscriber, you can start to kind of Patreon style send out announcements to them, and that just keep in touch with your audience, basically. Very fictional. We've got some static pages which we started to create. We're doing some event storming for this. There's some main domains here. So we've got like a catalog, the audience, analytics, billing, invites, and team. The features we're focusing on are the beta access list, skipping the waiting list, registering podcast, searching, following, subscribing, giving podcast analytics, any featured podcasts, and audience management. Cheers, Lars. Thank you very much. Thanks for coming. So last time we did some event storming, and we were looking at how we're going to respond to events. Hey, Joe, you are early today. You're definitely earlier. So I've been playing around, having a look at what we were doing, and there's something that bugged me. So the way parts of this were working, if we go to the catalog to, I was going to zoom in a little bit to make sure it is all visible. So we're fetching metadata for podcast using Open Graph. Now that works, but it's not very nice, if I'm honest. Not quite what I'm looking for. So if you look at any data feed for a podcast, we've got Full Stack Radio here, but today we're going to work on the PHPUgly podcast. Hey, Sari, thanks. Any good resources to learn PHP? Oh, there's loads. There's loads. Let me just find one for you. We thrive. Here we go, and here is a really good video. I happen to know it's a good video because I did it. It's a very, very straightforward. Hey, Isaac, drop that in there. So feel free to go to that link. That is me going through the basics of PHP for someone else called We Strive, who are really cool tech community. If you go on there, you can see there's like a PHP community. You can join the community. You can log in, and I don't know if I remember my login, but we will see. Let's see if I remember my login. No, I do not remember my login. Not now. I'll open up Firefox. I'll be brave. It's a really cool community. You should definitely check this one out. We Strive. Here we go. I'm automatically logged in because it remembered my credentials. Just what I want. So it's still in kind of a beta stage at the moment. There is like a PHP community. There's quite a lot going on. There's always resources being posted. You can go to the feed, you can discover things, you can add your own link, you can share posts, discover content and people. There's me. And then you get your profile and you can connect social channels, and this is their fresh new look that I've been working on. So feel free to check that one out. It's pretty cool. On ramp as well is definitely another good one. So back to where I was. PHPUgly. So if we look at their feed here, if you see this channel part all the way up to where we're looking at item here, this is just these items here, their podcast episodes themselves. Everything above that, all of that is information about the podcast itself. So sending a request to crawl a website when we could just be pulling it directly from the feed just doesn't make sense. So I'm going to refactor it today to use the feed itself. Why bother messing around with Open Graph when I can just do this? So to do that, we need to take a few steps. So if you remember last time, we were working on event storming and we had our aggregates over here. So we can record that a podcast was created. And then we have events for the podcast created is this, where we're just passing in our data transfer object and integer for the user's ID. And that's all coming from a podcast factory, which creates a data transfer object. Then we have got projectors, which will create it. And then we've got reactors. And our reactor is fetch a podcast from the aggregate UID. Great. So get meta information on podcast from an external URL. That works. And then dispatch another job to fetch feed items. Now we're going to refactor this part because that's the part that's actually reacting to things happening. We've saved something into the database and we've saved something with a URL. And from that, we're going to react to that entity being added, and we're going to start working with it and doing stuff, basically. So what we need to do is we will need to remove that, basically. So podcast items dispatch, what we need to do, we need to make a new one. So we'll create a new job. And this, we might refactor both of those. So one of the jobs is, if I open up Table Plus and just drag this onto the screen, if we just go down to this one, if you look at the podcasts here, we haven't got anything yet. So I'm probably going to work on just adding something in a little bit, to create a quick seeder so we can start doing stuff. What we need to be doing, let's reorganize that because I don't need Notion for a while and I don't need Safari much. What we want to be doing is we're creating it, we're passing in some form values which have like a title and like a feed URL and an external URL, maybe at a minimum. What we want to do, as soon as we get that information, we want to react to it. Okay, so we're going to store it in the database, and then we're like, okay, now that we've saved this entity in the database, we want to get that feed URL. We want to process that feed. We want to update our podcast from everything that's stored within the feed. And we want to start kicking off pulling in those podcast episodes. So let's look at quickly refactoring these so we can get something a little bit nicer. So what we'll probably call this is process podcast feed dispatch. And we're going to pass through the, we'll just pass through the aggregate UUID for now. We want the UUID to be passed through. And then if we go to that event itself, we can get the DTO, we can get the event DTO, and from there we can get the feed URL, which is a nice string for us to use. So it means that we don't actually have to do any sort of lookups there. And we can just reduce that crazy load and just start working with it. So first thing we need to do is do a little bit of cleanup. Don't need any of that anymore. So now we need to create this job. So let's create this job in here. And that is going to be relatively similar to most of these. So I'm just going to grab the first part of this file, drop it in there. And we're just going to rename this one to what it needs to be. And what we're passing in is a string as a UUID and string as a feed URL. So they're just the two things that will be stored and serialized when we push it to a queue. And the important thing to remember there is you don't want to be passing like entire models to be serialized into your database, because that storage is going to start to get expensive. And you don't want lots of very expensive queues stored, because your database is just going to start getting bloated. So we want to handle this. So the first thing we need to do is, when we handle this, is it needs to return void. Perfect. So how are we going to work with this? We've got a UUID, we've got a feed URL. So what we were doing before is we were getting the data, finding the podcast. If we had a podcast, we'd update it, we'd do fetching images, and we'd do lots of crazy stuff. But then in the fetching podcast items, what we would do is just respond with headers. If it failed, throw an exception. Otherwise, we get the feed in the channel. So all we need is that, really. So what we could probably do here is create an action that will handle this specific section. So I'm going to create a new directory here called actions. And this is going to be under podcasts, so actions, podcasts. And we're just going to say fetch feed. So this is a brand new class. It's not anything boilerplate from Laravel. It is simply just a nice, simple, plain old PHP class just to work with. So we can say caster, domains, catalog, actions, podcasts. And this one is called the fetch feed. Now, all this class needs to do is fetch a feed. So we're going to have one very simple static method, handle. And that is going to accept. This specific one is going to take a URL probably. So we can now come to something like this. And we go, okay, so basically we can grab that, drop all of this into here, import that class, and let's just go through it. So first thing we're going to do is the response is going to be, let's get the headers. HTTP facade with the headers, we want to make sure we pass through the accept application XML, because if that's not passed, it might give you unexpected results. Best to be declarative with that. Then we're doing a GET request to this URL, which we can now update to the URL we've passed through. Then if the response failed, throw an exception. Throws a request exception. So I can just drop this in here. So it's clear. Yep. And then we're getting the feed, casting it to an array, getting the channel, we're also casting that to an array. And then we can just return the feed and the channel like that. So we're just going to return an array from this action. So again, nice and clean. We create our response by using the HTTP facade with the headers of accept application XML. We just perform a GET request to the URL we pass through. If the response failed for any specific reason, that could be a client exception, it could be a server exception. Basically, an error occurred is what's happened. We just want to throw the exception. So that throw method there, just throw an exception if a server or client error occurred. Nice and clean. We're just going to tag this as a specific exception that's going to be caught, just in case we want to extend it for any reason. And then straight away, we're going to jump in and we're going to get the feed. We're going to load the XML string from the response body, and we're going to cast it to an array because XML is a nightmare to work with. And then we're going to do the exact same thing with a channel, because the channel within the feed is also pretty nasty. Pretty nasty, I'm not going to lie. Then we're just going to return in an array that feed and that channel. So what we need to do here is come to this screen. Let's just open up Invoker, because Invoker is absolutely fantastic for this. Let's load this one up. So jobs and events, we can come to domain, catalog, jobs, process podcast feed. So we can pass it a UUID. This is, we're not validating anything right now. And then from the feed URL, if we just come to just search PHPUgly, simplecasts, what we could do is, here's the RSS icon up there. We can just copy that link, drop that in there, dispatch it, and let's see what it says. Event was dispatched. Cool, that was useful. So process podcast feed, when we handle it, this is where we're going to trigger things. So here is our action which we want to be triggering. So all we need to do is let's say we are going to get the feed and the channel back, and we want fetch feed import. Oh, it's already imported, is it? How very nice of you. Fetch feed, public, static function handle. And we just need to pass through the URL for that one. So let's say that the URL is going to be this feed URL. Now let's die and dump, or let's not die. Let's just dump and dump. Let's just get out. Let's see what we get back from feed, and let's see what we get back from that channel itself. So dispatch. Perfect. So yes, we know something went wrong because we expected that. We got an array. That's the first one. Here's our first array. Hard to see. Unfortunately, you cannot zoom in on Invoker. It's definitely something I will ask about at some point. So to make it simpler, why don't I just, so we've got the feed, we've got the channel. So let's just die and dump on the channel, because that's what we want for this initial phase. We want the channel. So dispatch, let's get the channel information. So here's a channel. Got the generator, got a title, got a description, copyright information, language, published date, got image. We've got an image straight away. We've got a link, and then we're straight into the items. So what we can do with this is quite a lot. We can drop that for now. Let's go podcast equals podcast domain model, and then we want the the one by UUID, and the UUID being passed through is this UUID. Ooh. So we should now have a podcast. If podcast is no, then we are just going to throw a new, probably do with making some custom exceptions really, couldn't we? Close all those down. So catalog, new folder, exceptions. And in this one, we will just create a podcast not found exception. We'll add exception on the end of it. So we'll just quickly declare some strict types so we can be type safe everywhere with everything. Catalog exceptions. And this just extends exception. And that is all we want. We just want a specific exception here. So we'll just throw it. And because we're extending the normal exception, we can just pass through a message. Import that class quickly. And our message is going to be podcast with UUID not found while trying to process. Something nice and explanatory. You know, we know we're trying to process a podcast, so we know we're going to go to the process podcast feed. There we go. A little bit nicer. And what else does it give? What else can we do? Code, throwable, previous. Nothing really to get there, is there? So if we do have one, then we can get that podcast and we can update that podcast with information from the channel itself. So we can, they've given us a title. We don't want to override that. So we'll get the generator. We will update that generator. And actually what we're going to be doing is something very similar to this. So we'll get that description quickly. So let's just go channel. Then in there. So we've got a generator and we've got a description. So that is generator is simplecast. Description is all of that with a few things in there. Then we can get the copyright and language. So we can say copyright is channel copyright. And then the language is the channel language, because now we don't actually have to ask them for the language. We can detect that from their feed. And then we don't have to worry about any sort of validation or anything like that. Then the pub date. What is our pub date? So if we go to this here, we're not actually worried about the pub date. That's fine. And the image. So the image is we're casting that to an array object. So we can just say image, and we are going to get the image there. So that's because that's XML already. We can try and see how this part works. So just cast the contents of the channel image into an array, because it's currently a simple XML element, which should give us an array with link, title, and URL all within it. And it should be nice and clean. We've updated that. And then what else we've got? We've got feed. So what can we do with feed? So let's just grab that. This is where we want to kind of do stuff. So in our reactor, we are dispatching something straight away because we're reacting to something. And I believe that happens on a queue. I could be completely wrong there. So let's have a look on the documentation. So here's the Laravel event sourcing from Sparsy. And using reactors, advanced usage, handling exceptions, storing metadata, adding, removing projectors and reactors, or storage stuff, storage model. Okay. Doesn't say anything. So what we'll do is we'll just have to fetch it again. So instead of getting just that back, we might just have to receive the channel, and we won't worry about the feed from this is podcast feed. That's that job. And here is the action fetch feed, which we can call again, which we're going to be calling anyway. So I may as well, for the sake of keeping it simple, keep that like that. Just don't use feed. It might be a variable I'm not using, but it's not going to kill anything right now. It's complaining about something. What's it complaining about? Something here. What's it complaining about? I can't see what it's complaining about. So what we'll do is we will just run it and see what it does. First things first, we need to create a fake. Missing a bracket. Oh, where am I looking? Where am I looking? Not there. There. Good spot. Good eyes. Good eyes. I wondered why that hadn't gone a little bit dimmer. Good eyes. Thank you. So models. Let's go to our domain catalog models. We need to create some data, don't we? We need to create a user. I've got a user. Cool. We got me. So I can now go to. Do I want to podcast? I don't know if I need to do that. So let's create a new podcast. We are going to say I am the owner. We'll just auto-generate that. We'll pass in that, and we'll say PHPUgly. Generator description. All of this stuff is just part of Invoker. It's just reading from the database. Then what we also want is to come back to this, so we can just grab that again and stick that in the feed URL, and let's see what it complains about. Let's just do the quick create that and update that can be null. Validating. No results found. Okay. So let's just close that. Refresh. Did it create it? No, it didn't. So we're going to have to create a category. We'll have to do this a little bit more manually. Let's create a test category for now. Come over to podcast. And we can now say Steve test 1, 2, 3, 4. PHPUgly. Generator null. Description we'll keep null. Author and copyright will keep null. Feed will drop in. We'll select that. It needs to show validation really, doesn't it? So let's have a look at our for podcasts. So we need an author. Oh, okay. Let's just update this because we don't want it to be too difficult. So external URL, we could probably set that to nullable. We want the feed, and that's it. We can get everything else, I think. Maybe. Or not. Right, let's just undo those. What do I have to do? Because I've already built parts of this. Title, author, language, and some links. So title, yep. Author, who should we choose? Fucking Eric. Copyright language, we'll just say EN for now, English. External URL and feed URL. So I'm pretty sure if I just come to here, I can just get their site quickly. There we go. Bam. External URL in. Feed URL owner. Save. Hey, we've got one. We have got one. So now I can just come back to Invoker jobs, process podcast feed, dispatch. Okay, podcast with not found. We're trying to process feed. Perfect. Perfect. Don't know where I got that from though. So we've got UUID and a feed URL. Where is it getting the 2468 from? So we're passing in, close all of that down. Don't need any of that. And we are hitting this process podcast feed right here. Then when we land, let's just down dump on this UUID. Okay, so we're dispatching something. Is that already being stored in the database? Reload. I haven't got jobs in here, have I? Store events, what we got? Nothing. So UUID. Let's just jump into the constructor. See if it's gonna do anything different. That is really strange. There's a string. It's getting it there. It's complaining when I pass in a UUID from here, which is really odd. So if I just grab the right class, it is Ramses, which is that one. So UUID, let's just get that and say string. So let's just grab that UUID there. Right, so close that, come over to our database, come to our podcast, let's update that. That's been saved. So now we can just say dispatch. That's looking like the right one now. So now we can dispatch it again. The event was dispatched. Cool. So back to our database. We shouldn't have anything in here yet, should we? Yes. So we've got a generator, simple cast, title, description, author, copyright language, owner. I don't know where I'm going to get that from, but the image. Here's the image. we've got a link, we've got a title, and we've got a URL for the image. Everything else is all linked up. We've got everything that we're going to want. I don't even know why I've got an owner on there anymore. I think that might have been to do with the Apple feed that you can't actually use. But we'll worry about that later. That's not anything important. I can drop that column very quickly. So this fetch metadata for podcasts, that can go, which means I can also do a quick search for Open Graph. Yep, I'm not using it anymore. I'm only using it in my composer, so I can composer remove. Dump autoloader. Excellent. So that has been updated. We are now fetching just a podcast feed, and that's been reduced to something nice and simple. That's not being used at the minute. There's podcast. So an exception if it doesn't exist, then we update the podcast. Very clean, very simple. Nothing too strenuous going on. So the next thing is, once we've got that, we kind of want stuff to be running constantly, right? We want to go to event storming. Is it in here? Job dispatch fetching podcast episodes. An email is sent to the author. So we also want to dispatch a couple of jobs within that reactor. We do want to dispatch a couple of jobs. So what we also want to dispatch is this podcast feed. So we got all of that. Fetch podcast items. We can clean some of this up now as well. So we can say fetch podcast items. And we want to dispatch. Can you add any optional arguments to this? No. So what we want to throw into that, again, we're probably just going to get the exact same thing, pass that into there, dispatch those two jobs. One's going to do all of that, but I don't see why we can't just do that all in one job then. If we're just going to be dispatching two jobs, let's just clean that up. Let's make it easier. So we don't need that anymore. Collect. Pop. Let's just copy that because we're going to want that. So we've handled it. We've got all of that. Is null. Podcast update. Now let's just do a die dump on the feed and see what we get. Dispatch. Attributes, not interested in. Channel, not exciting. So what we need is something like this, channel item. So there's a channel. We don't even need the feed, do we? We definitely don't need the feed at all. So we can go to that, come over to here, and let's just return the channel. That's cleaned. Still returning an array. We don't have feed anymore. We get the channel, every channel item, map over each item. Do that, and cool. Right. Let's see what it looks like. Excellent. We have an episode. Yes, I am definitely going to be writing tests. At the minute, I'm kind of hacking about trying to see how I want it to work. So when in these situations, I always write them after the fact because it's so much easier. So, this, I believe, would be another good time to look at an aggregate. I don't know if there's anything against dispatching, reacting to an event which dispatches a job which creates an aggregate. I don't know whether it's going to be chaining on too much. Possible. It is possible. But we're going to play with it. We'll see how it looks. So we need another aggregate. So this time we need an episode aggregate root. Let's start this off. Strict types as 1. Namespace, caster, aggregates, class extends aggregate root. So what do we need in this aggregate root? Not too much. We need a not create podcast, something like create episodes, public function, create episodes, and within that we will pass through we definitely want to pass through the podcast. We'll have the podcast at that point, so we can grab that podcast. So we can now pull that model in. We've got the podcast. And then we are going to record, let's say we're going to pass through an array for the 4 episodes. And this will return itself. So what we're going to do, let's give it some real estate. I have got a new keyboard coming, by the way, so I do apologize if it is noisy. So we can return this. And then we need to say this, record that. So we've got a domain event. This is where our domain event will go. And then we will want to persist it. So we're recording the fact that we have created the episodes, which we can then react to so that we can email. So let's create this event. And we're going to call that create episodes, exceptions, podcast created. We'll just do something like episodes created or something. Something clean, simple. Episodes created. Let's declare some split types. Caster events. And does it need to extend anything? Extends should be stored. Should be stored, and then in the constructor, we just need to have our arguments, which we're going to accept. So for this one, we're accepting a domain transfer object and an int for a user. Now, at this stage, when we're triggering it, we've already got the podcast itself. We've got parts of it. So I don't know whether we need to store that because the aggregate root has already got the UUID for it. So we might not even need to pass that through. What we'll do instead, we'll pass through the podcast UUID instead. Keep it cleaner. So we'll have a UUID available, a podcast UUID, so it's obvious what it is, and then we'll have an array of episodes. And that's all we need within that event. So we can go and close some of this down. Just sharpen our focus a little bit. Here's our aggregate here. So we can say a new episodes created, import class. And that accepts two parameters, the podcast UUID and the episodes. So the podcast UUID is podcast UUID, and the episodes is episodes. It's all relatively straightforward, that part, right? So this record that. Persist. Have I spelled persist wrong? I spelled persist wrong. Of course I did. Okay, so we're recording that this domain event happened, and then we're persisting that. So in our projectors, we now need to kind of store that episode created, I believe. Projectors. So in the other one, we are just doing a quick podcast projector, and then we're on podcast created. So what we need an episode projector. And this one is going to be more creating multiple. So namespace, caster, catalog projectors. Got the projector there, and I believe we need to extend projector. And a public function on event name on episodes created, and this will receive the event and aggregates UUID. So got the UUID, and then we just need that event, which is going to be the episodes created as an event. We've now got it. So our event's happened. So within here, we've got access to the event and the UUID for the aggregate. Close some of this down. Podcast projector we don't need. We'll keep that. Episode created, that's done. Process podcast feed we'll come back to. Meta we'll worry about, that's all done. So how are we going to make sure this triggers? This is where, because I'm playing, I'd usually wrap things in a test. So typically what we do in that one is podcast create, blah, 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 we'll do stuff. So in the episode projector, we need to kind of, cycle over the event episodes as an episode. And then we can start to save that episode. And then eventually we can react to this and send the email. So in here, event sourcing, what we need to get is episode aggregate root, retrieve the UUID. This is where we need to say UUID for to string. And then we need to, let's go to the docs for this part. And then aggregates. Where are we? It's creating, testing. Here's our account aggregate. retrieve, and then we're just going to say do something. We're going to say here's our aggregate, create episodes, and we're going to pass through the podcast UUID, which is going to be, I think I need to say use podcast there, and then I can say podcast UID. We now got that, and we also need to pull in episodes. Which is that. Oh, okay. We need to move this out of there, don't we? So if we just, for now, I'll just say episodes, and that will all happen. We need to move this out. Don't really want to collect it now. We're going to do something slightly different. We're just going to get the episodes. What was in there? Channel item. So let's make sure we're getting what we're expecting. Dispatch that. Ooh, no, we're not. Which channel item as item? Let's say that the item is now an array version of itself. Let's redump out that channel item and see what it does. Might be a nicer way to do this, but we'll figure that out as we play. No, it's just telling me where to go, isn't it? Let's dump on that item. Dispatch that. Simple XML element. So we've got that item there. Let's just dump on it in there. Is that going to give me what I like? Yes, it is. So I'm going to have to do some transforming within this part here. So we've got the item there. We'll say episodes is an array. And while we're transforming it, we can say the item title array push, and we are going to push into the episodes array, and we are going to push title as item title, the description as item description, because that bit's fine. And we need to double check our episode model to see how that's all being stored quickly. So let's go back to our episode. And this was published at, an episode is published at, and we are just going to use carbon to pass a date quickly. That accepts. So item update. So title, description, published at. Let's go for author as the author. Got a link, which I believe is also on here, but that's external URL. There's our link. And we'll just drop through the external ID as item GUID. Publish that is there. So then we just need the media. So the media is going to be, let's go cast the item enclosure. So let's die and dump on item enclosure first. Dispatch that. Syntax error. Okay, I can live with that. Send. Okay, that is good. That's what I thought. And when I cast that to an array, is it going to give me everything that I want? Yes. Although it's going to go within an attributes. So if I just do quickly media to that, then cast media, shouldn't need to cast for that bit. Now we got it. So we can get the media there, and we can just grab this part and swap it out for that. Group those together, publish that, lots of cool stuff, cool. And that'll be that, that'll be that. That'll give us our episodes. So down here, if we just do a die and dump on episodes, this should now give us all of the episodes we were expecting. Dispatch. Yes, we've got an array of I'm a PHPUgly, a description, which is currently a XML element, which we will fix. Carbon, which is great. Great, so it's just that description that's causing that issue now. Stand up on that a second, and let's see what I need to do. Description is that. So let's see what we can get it to work with. Cool. So if we just cast that to an array, is it going to say anything extra? No. Okay, so if we just cast it to a string, we have got the content. Bam. Cast that to a string. Because XML is horrible. So it's giving everything we need. Perfect, perfect, perfect. It's got all of the show notes, all of the big old description, which you can then work to render out and make it look nice. The author, external ID, external URL, media. So then if we grabbed this, for example, in our UI, we can then go directly to that and start playing that episode. So within our UI, it'll be nice and quick and easy. So drop that down, dump. Let's see what happens now. Will it complain? Event was dispatched. Perfect. So what we want to look at is stored events. Episodes created. We've got our podcast. We haven't got anything going on in here yet. It looks like this doesn't want to trigger. which means we need to come back a step to our reactor. No, no, not that. We need to come back somewhere else. Okay, not an event there. Can we just do a dime dump on event there? Will that be triggered? No, we're not even hitting that. So we need to hook this up quickly. Event sourcing service provider. So add a projector. I'm pretty sure you can add projectors. Go back, double check the docs. Projectors, projectors. Writing, creating, and registering. So I believe you can add more than one at a time. So add projectors, you just pass through an array. Cool. And now we can just say, oh, here's that one. We also want to add the episode projector. Reactors we will add soon. So how are we going to do this nicely? I know. Let's migrate fresh. Let's just do that. Bam. So close all of that down. Is it going to be Cedar? Feed Cedar. Don't be Cedar. Feed Cedar. Yes, feed Cedar. We'll do it in here. So what we could say is aggregate. No. Get the aggregate name. Domain catalog aggregates. Podcast aggregate root. So first thing we're going to need is a EUID is get good old Ramsey's package. We want to keep a reference to that one. Podcast aggregate root. We want to grab that one. And we will say EUID is the UID we're passing here. And we want to say podcast, create podcast. And then we're going to have a podcast here. So here's our podcast, and we're going to use the podcast factory. Build, which has got attributes. And the attributes here is expecting. And then int user ID. So we'll also just grab the first user. Here. User ID is, we just say user first ID, because I know I've got it. And the attributes that we're going to want in here, let's drop these, drop that back. Let's go to podcast factory. We need title, need that. Let's just grab that and we'll just use that for now. Don't need that. Don't need any of this. Now I can just grab that. Grab them. So we want PHPUgly generator is going to be simple casts. This is PHPUgly podcast, which will get overwritten anyway. PHPUgly owner, PHPUgly language ENGB, although they're probably US. Come to think of it, external URL is phpugly.com. And then if we come back and just grab that link one more time, feed URL, and just grab the first user, aggregate, retrieve that. This is what will be happening like in your controller, for example. So you'd validate things and you're like, okay, cool, your input's valid. At this point, you'd probably be doing like a request validated, be passing all of that information in, passing in the author user instead, which would then fire off the event. So let's see if this will work. So let's see if we get any errors, or if we have any errors first. Well, there's one, I can stop. Let's go to our database. Cool. Stored events, nothing in podcasts. We've got nothing so far. Great. Let's make sure that our seeder knows about that. Yes, it does. It knows about that. So now run it. Ooh. Seed. Bam. Okay, so podcast owner failed for caster.podcasts. Okay, so we also need owner, author. Okay, let's have a look at the migration and see what's going on. So podcast table is here. So I'm going to drop the owner's JSON column. That's not even used anymore. That isn't even used. So let's just do a quick owner, drop some of these, feed seeder, drop podcast app, drop that, podcast factory, drop that, drop that, and drop that, and that. The owner is actually going to be a user, which is fine. Excellent. So now I can just close all of those again. Close to the light. And let's just run that one more time. This is what it does. So now author doesn't have a default value. So my bad. Stepping slow. Doesn't have a default value, blah, blah, blah. Projector. Ooh, okay. So this is where we can start cycling through. So that works. We know that works. This is an author. Does it? Do we want the author? We don't really want the author, do we? No. So let's just drop that from the migration as no. Let's make it nullable on the migration, not drop it, because that would be silly. That would be very silly, Steve. Don't do that. That again is something that will be pulled from the feed itself. Step back through. And now we're getting a die and dump on all of the episodes because things are reacting. So stored events, podcast created, episodes created. Here's our podcast. Haven't got our episodes yet. So that was nice and fast. That's what I wanted to see. Something nice and clean. So in our projector, episode projector, we've got our event there. Here's our event. Got the episodes. So if I just do a die and dump on the episode, and we'll just make some space, run that again, we should have an episode out, and we do. We have got a nice array with everything we could possibly want. So now we can just simply, in the projector, episode. Okay. So, what does that episode need? Let's sort those imports, make them nicer. So we're going to have a UUID. We'll use the aggregate UUID that's been passed in. We'll have a title, which I believe we have. So we can say event. Let's go to the event quickly. Event. Oh no, we don't need the event, we need the episode. Episode title. Forgot what I was looking at for a second there. The description is the episode description. Scroll down a bit more. Then we'll have the author as the episode author. After that, we will have the external URL, episode external URL, the external ID, and the media will be the episode media, because we just want to store all of that in there because we want that length, we want the type, and we want the URL. And the published at just be that. And that is everything we should need, other than one potential thing. The podcast UUID we're going to need. Yes, we definitely want a link back to that podcast UID. Archived is going to default to false. And we want the podcast ID. So let's drop that one in there. So we can say event podcast UUID. Done. Excellent. So that should now create all of them. If I clear my view again, reseed. Let's see. Ooh, we got breakages. Invalid date format. Podcast ID. Okay, so we're going to have to not pass through the podcast UUID to that part. We're going to want to pass through the podcast ID itself. That is, where did we do that? UID. No, we're doing that in a, yeah, we are, I think. Yeah, maybe. we're doing it here. So we're going to do podcast ID instead. Not quite what I wanted, but hey. ID. Just go through and update all of these. There's actually now going to be an integer. Podcast ID, blah, blah, blah. Ooh, okay, so apparently it is coming through as a string. So we'll just play with that. Just see what happens. That's fine. That's fine. That's fine. That. Migrate and fresh. Seed. So, argument must be of type string int given. What are you doing? Called in line 79. Line 79. Let's start there. Excellent. That's doing that. That will be an integer, which is going to do it here, which is going to be that one, which is going to be an integer. An integer. Done, done, done. Check again. Saving, saving, saving. Perfect. So that, in theory, should be full now. All of the episodes, one podcast, and we've got the events. And we've stored a lot of information about it. So we can now go through and truncate. Okay, so we will truncate and disable foreign key checks. And on our episodes, we can also truncate, disable foreign key checks, save, nothing in there, nothing in there. So now we should be able to say PHP artisan event replay or something, podcast fetch, package discover, migrate stuff, make stuff, inertia event sourcing, replay. Yes, bam. So now reload. My podcast is back. All of my episodes are back. Excellent. Next step is to look at how are we going to do this? Empty that bin quickly because it's annoying me. So I'm just going to close Evoker for a second. What we want to do is mail trap. Let's just go to my account here. Here's the one I'm using for work. Let's just grab the Laravel 7 will do. Bam. So I will be resetting these. Don't worry, people. Don't worry, I will be resetting them. You aren't going to get me taking the piss out of them. Right, okay, so we've got the mailer and the host, the port, the username, password, and encryption. So there we go. Got all of those. The from address will be app@castor.com. Oh, we'll call it .io because we're a cool startup. And the app name is Castor, like the Castor sugar. So, right, we want another reactor. So in our catalog reactors, we're going to have another one saying notify author of episode sync. I like to kind of say very explicitly what we're actually doing. So namespace, caster, reactors, class extends reactor. Right, so what do we want in the reactor? We want to on event name from the looks of it. Yeah, on episodes created. On episodes created, we will receive the event. And we will also apparently receive the string UUID. Great aggregate. That's great. We got that part there. So at this stage, we can kind of say, okay, so we've kind of got the event. Let's just dump that event out there. Let's hook that up and let's see if we see it being triggered. Let's put these in here, and then we're going to have notify author of episode, blah, 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 class, done. Cool. Time to see what triggers. Migrate and seed, do it. Cool, so we've got our event. Not very clear because it's similar to other output we've seen. So what I'll do at the end of it, I'll just dump that one and I'll die and dump reacted. Doing all of this, we're doing lots of magic, and we've reacted, as you can see down the bottom just there. So we are reacting to this now. So we don't need half of the stuff within there. But what we can do, hopefully, we've got the aggregate UUID, which should give us, we should now technically, it's all the same UUID. It is all the same UUID because it all belongs to the same import there for that podcast episode. Might look at fixing that later, but first we will we'll go to the episode quickly. Let's come to the models on the podcast for that. We need that, but we need it in a few places. So what we're going to do, we're going to create a new concerns namespace, and we're just going to say has UUID. Again, let's just declare some strict types. Caster catalog models. Concerns, create has UUID, drop that one in there. That's going to be an eloquent model or null, where static where UUID first, done, cool. So then I can grab this and I can drop that, and we can say use has UUID. Then we can add that same thing onto there, onto the episode, so we can query against that too. Podcasts. So we've got all of that. So now we can just do, let's do a die and dump on the episode model. So the UUID is the aggregate UUID. So this will just give us the first one. They're all saved with the same UUID currently. That's not a problem right now. We will fix that. Bang, we've got one, which means we can start to look at the episode. Got the episode. got a podcast, and that podcast has got an owner. So we can say load in the podcast owner. Let's see if that's still going to play ball. Now it's complaining. Build a UUID. Okay, so this is where we need to fix that. So that is UUID first. So now we're just going to quickly refactor how we are handling this. So that isn't going to be as important. So we will create a new builders, and we'll, for now, we only need the one builder, and we'll create the episode builder. This is a really nice little utility class that you can use with Laravel, which means you can move all of your scopes out to its own separate class. To a nice builders namespace, and we're just going to extend the eloquent builder, and then we're just going to have a public function UUID to return itself, so you can chain, and then we just say return this where UUID, so we'll PHP this. So a column is that, and the value is the UUID we are going to pass in. Done. So there's the episode builder. So now we just need to put this in here. So in the model itself, new eloquent builder, and we can return a new episode builder where we're passing in the query that we've already built because everything's being changed, and then this is going to return an episode builder, all hooked up, which means that all of our scopes can now move to this nice simple class here. So we'll add another one for the sake of it, archived, which I believe is a Boolean. So we can add in public function archived. Archived. So we can just say return this where column archived, the value is true. We can also add a public you add a published, so anything that's not archived is published. It's just a little bit of domain knowledge at that point, isn't it? So we can just kind of switch that round and do that. Nice and clean. All archived is archive. Let's make sure we got the spelling correct. Cool. So this doesn't actually have to duplicate that, so we can just say return this archived where archived is false. Why duplicate a query when you can make it clean? So all we're doing there is published is just going to call this model but pass in a separate value. Nice and clean. Glad you like it, Daryl. Thank you very much. Right, so there's a builder there. That's been hooked up nicely. No longer needed the builder or the episode. Has UID can be ignored right now. So then this will hit the scope. So now this should not fail. this should work as I am expecting it. Yes, null. Wait a minute. No, it should be returning something. Let's just go episode first in random order first. Give me some episodes. Let's go and see what happens. We got one. So it's not liking this aggregate UUID. That's fine. We can live with that. I think. So we want to look at the event itself then. So that event is going to give us all of this information, which will have the podcast ID. That's what we want. We want that podcast ID because we don't actually care too much about the episode at this point. Is that giving us what we want? It is giving us what we want. So that we can skip that step. Perfect. So now we can just say podcast equals podcast. Please be the model. Yep, we don't need the episode anymore. We can sort those imports. Drop that so we've got some real estate. And we will just find the event podcast ID, and we will also say, okay, we also want your owner. So let's just time dump on the podcast at this point. So now when we run this again, we should now just get a nice podcast with a user, which is me. Perfect. So we need to make a notification. Now, what I've done, I haven't made any of the make commands, but I have gone through some of the stubs, and I believe notifications isn't in there. Damn it, why haven't they published that? Okay, so we'll just figure that out. PHP artisan make notification, and we'll just call this. Let's go to Notion a second. We'll say podcast is syncing notification. Bam, that's what we're going to want. So at this point, we would say podcast owner notify a new podcast is syncing notification, and we could pass through the podcast itself so that we know which one, just in case it got more than one. So I'd close some of these. We'll go to that notification, which is currently up here, but we're going to move this now because that is a domain notification for the catalog. So let's just move that into there. Notifications. Just let's fix up some of this namespacing and add in some script types. And then our namespace is going to be Casta domains, not models, but notifications. Let's sort those imports. Let's make this PHP 8. And what are we passing into this? We are passing in a podcast. So we can add a public podcast via notifiable. We only want to send an email at this point. To mail, we'll just do a quick mail message in there. Let's import that. Class is already imported. Perfect. So now we can look at this mail here. This is going to be an array. Not going to turn it into an array because we're not actually going to save it in the database. We're not too bothered about that right now. So new mail message. We can have a subject which has a string, and our subject is going to be your podcast. This podcast title is now syncing. Ooh. Even better. Caster. So you can filter nice and easily. Caster now syncing. And the line is going to have a line. We don't want an action. Let's add lots of cool stuff. Thank you for submitting your podcast to our platform. Just to let you know, we have now started crawling this, and we'll do this on a daily basis. Technically, I'd probably push this to a mail class later on, but right now I'm just testing. Thank you for using our application. So now we can import. Bam, bamly, bamly, bam. So screens, Safari. Let's just clear that. Perfect. Now, seed. Are we going to react? We didn't. Ooh, okay. Error exception. Models user. No such file or directory. Okay, so why can it not find shared models user? What's it complaining about? Oh, we complain about something. Domains catalog. Oh, I see what's going on. For some reason, I think I moved something without meaning to. Now let's have a look. Feed seeder, lots is going on. Perfect. So, firstly, our database. Excellent. We've got lots of episodes. Got a podcast. Our user for me is there. All of our episodes are there. We've got all of our stored events. And I received an email saying that PHPUgly is now syncing. So thank you for submitting your podcast. Thanks for using our platform. Regards, Caster. That was a lot easier than I thought it would be. So that's that. We're syncing things. Let's just add everything. Episode 3, working with podcast episodes and refactoring podcast meta fetching. Let's all that up. So what else can we do? What else can we do? What time is it? 9:25 here in the UK. That definitely should be a catchphrase. Right. So again, for anyone interested, if you wanted to have a look through the code base, I'm just popping this on the screen for you now so you can quickly see it. github.com/juststeveking/caster. Feel free to have a look, go through and pick apart my code and tell me how I did it really horribly at 9 o'clock in the evening when I've got 5 kids. What else can we add? What else can we add? Go to readme quickly. Artisan command. So we've processed them. So now we need to look at creating commands. I can live with that. So git add, git commit, update readme. So PHP artisan, make a command. For now, I'm going to stick this in a podcasts fetch episodes. And there. So I spoke about this last time, and the way that I'm building this is that all our business logic is in the source directory under its own separate namespace, being loaded in through Composer here. Now, our application itself is in there. So let's take an example of we want to move this to Symfony, or we want to move this to a slim PHP, or we want to move this to Laminas, anything else, any other PHP-based system. In theory, all we need to do is move this part here. Maybe we could follow hexagonal architecture at some point within here, so that we can have less framework dependent parts going on. Got that because we don't need it. We don't actually do this. I don't think we don't even run this one anymore. So bye bye. Let me just run a migrate fresh and see. Oh, fetch episodes. Oh wait, does not declare overturn. Cannot. Oh, that is me. Why is that in there? You silly sausage. Go back to stubs. And let me just fix that. I think I was on autopilot. Yes, I was. That's fine. Cool. What was I saying? I was saying something. Can anyone remind me before I got too distracted? Oh yeah. Yes. In this part here, we could move this towards hexagonal architecture and start to be very framework independent with our domain code. And eventually it's something that you would do, but for a startup, when time is of essence and money is not very much going around, you have to go thick and fast, and you kind of find yourself working with the framework as much as possible, because you've got deadline after deadline, which was all due 3 weeks ago, which is all needed to be completed so that you can get paid in time. And it's hard. It's hard work. I've worked at a few myself, and having a family and working at a startup is not easy. But that's besides the point. This all of this domain code is very separate to our application. We've got a command here if we want it, but I don't want our console stuff to be within there at all. Anything to do with interacting in any way, I want to be within our application itself, because if we move this to Symfony, it's going to be needed to be done differently. So within our console, commands, podcasts, we're going to keep this within our app namespace, because that's where we're keeping our controllers. That's where we'll keep anything specific to do with how we interact through CLI or HTTP. So we will name this one Caster Sync, and a nice simple one. And this will just be sync podcast episodes with their feeds. Kind of simple, clean, easy, away we go. So first thing we want to do is we want to look at podcasts. So if we look at our catalog for the models for the podcast, is there anything on here that soft deletes? Great. We can filter them out straight away. So So we just want all podcasts. So let's say podcasts is podcast. We want them all. We need them all. You know, we want to cycle through every single one, right? We could cursor it. We could do stuff like that, and you know, that's something we'd optimize to later on. You know, if we go to cursor, I believe it is eloquent RM cursors. So we could say cursor as something. So, you know, I suppose we could use generator. So it might be quicker. It might, well, not quicker, but might be a little bit more efficient. But at the minute, we've only got one. We'll do it anyway. So let's drop that on. So for each podcast, cursor as podcast. And what cursor does is similar to a lazy method, of cursor can maybe used to significantly reduce your application's memory consumption when iterating. I'll tell you what, let me drop that in here so people can actually see it. Show this. This is, I believe this goes back to Laravel 7 also. In a more memory efficient way to loop over all of your items, because it only loads a certain amount into memory at a time. And I believe there is a default amount that you can use, but I'm not 100% sure. So podcast cursor as podcast. We've got all of them now. So let's just say, okay, we have got a podcast. So now we can say PHP artisan cluster sync. Bam. Source domain get like on a fetch podcast. Okay, so I need to clean up the kernel quickly because I have removed that. Bam. Okay, so let me zoom in a little bit more. So now we're focusing on this part. So we have got a podcast. We have got a PHPUgly podcast. There's its generator. Here's its description. That's a lot of quotes within there. I don't know whether it's meant to be like that, but we'll see how that displays if we need to clean it up in any way. Author is currently null, not a problem. Copyright, all rights reserved. That's in case they add anything specific. External URL, or we've got the feed URL, got an image or like image information. Right, so in here, we've got our podcast. What do we want to do? We want to, hey Oliver, thanks for joining me, buddy. Right, you're distracting me. You're making me blush. First, this podcast feed. Okay, so what do we want to do? UUID and a feed. Can we just dispatch this job? Can we just say, right, just dispatch it, just you know, send it. That's all I want. Send it away. Right, I'm going to zoom back out because that is like pretty zoomed in for me. All the pressure. I've been on here for a while, mate. Right, so we're going to pass through the UUID of the podcast and the feed URL. That will then update the podcast in case anything has changed, build up all of the episodes, and then retrieve them and create them. Not quite what I want, is it? Definitely not quite what I want. Do we want to do it another way? Aggregates podcast. So that's create podcast. So let's say public function sync podcast, which is going to receive a podcast. Drop this so we can see, and that should be all we need. Return itself. So then we can say this record that a domain event happened, and we're going to call this something like new podcast was synced, and we're just going to pass through what are we doing the other one, just passing through the podcast ID. We'll just pass through the podcast ID at that stage. I don't want to store too much really. And then we will persist and turn this. I spelled persist wrong again. No, I haven't. What's it complaining at? Unexpected. Yes, it is, because that belongs there. Silly sausage. Right. Should be stored. Yeah, it's quite fun. It is quite fun. So let's go to our events. Our events down here, and we'll just say, let's create a new one. And we'll do a podcast was synced. And it's going to be very similar to this. So we'll just grab that, drop that in there, and let's just make sure that the names match. Podcast was synced. And we're just passing through a podcast. Pretty sure we're just passing through the ID. Yep. So we can have that as an integer. And this is a podcast ID. So we can drop that. And that's all we need. That's literally it. Should be stored. Import that. That will now work. So that in our kernel fetch episodes, we can say that the podcast aggregate root retrieve. This is okay. Let's get the. Oh, it's been a long day. Retrieve the UUID. Because we don't need the UUID passed in, we can just pass it directly through here. So pass that in there, and then we can just say retrieve that, and we are going to say sync podcasts, sync podcast, and the podcast we pass in will be the podcast we are on. That is all that needs to do. That'll return. Right, that is that. That works. That's doing that. There's our event. Don't need to add anything to that. There's our aggregate root. Here's our command, which is currently not really doing much, but we'll have a look at that in a second. So where's the complaints coming from? Sync podcast argument must be of type domain catalog podcast. Okay. Let's import that. No. Okay. We're already pulling that in there. So this will have to be, we'll call it a model because we're passing through the Eloquent model itself. And that should resolve that problem without any horrible aliases. So if we come back to our stored events, podcast was synced, podcast ID, which means we can now have a projector, episode projector, no, podcast, on podcast created. So at this point we can say, or do we want to react, or do we just want to react? Reactors fetch fetch podcast meta. It's going to listen to a podcast created event. Can we rename this? Yes, we can. Right, okay, so we're just going to call this a podcast reactor. And then within here, rename that. Let's quickly sort those. And then down here, we're going to podcast reactor. And then in our here, we're going to rename the class itself as well. Quickly do a composer dumper autoloader. Excellent. And we're just going to PHP artisan migrate fresh seed. Let's make sure nothing breaks. That's still all going to work. And we will receive that email because we did clear the database. So that is expected behavior. So on the podcast reactor, we can say public function on that projector on podcast was synced. We are going to not need to return anything. We can pull in the podcast was synced event. That is all we will need. And then with that event, if we just quickly do a die and dump on that event, we've got our podcast was synced event, aggregate root UUID and aggregate root UUID version, sorry. All we need to do on this, so on created, we're just dispatching a job. So if we go back to our jobs, process podcast feed, we're going to, oh, what plugin? I am using the Starship. Here we go. I'm using this starship.rs. Drop it in here for you. It is really nice. Powered by Rust. You've got lots of cool stuff you can do, and it's just that on top of all my ZSH. Nice and clean. So I like the elephant there personally. So what this is retrieving, create episodes, and that's create episodes. It's going to record episodes created. And I'll just create a new job. Because we want something slightly different to this. It's going to get messy. I'll just hide that now. The jobs, we will do a very quick, did we move most factory action? Channel, fetch, handle, we can grab that, create a new job, sync podcast episode. Declare, let's give some real estate again so you can see. Just declare strict types, stick our namespace in. We are on jobs. So now we want to implement that, and we're going to do something else. Bam. So it is queuable. It also should be queued. It's dispatchable. Event dispatchable, I believe. Oh no, bus dispatchable. So we are dispatching through the bus, not as an event. My bad. Serialize models. interacts with queues. Perfect. So that's the basics done. And within that, don't need that anymore. Reactor. So when we sync this podcast episode, we want to pass through a UUID, which is going to be the podcast UUID. We want to pass through the podcast UUID and the feed URL, because we are going to do something very similar to what we're doing in these actions for the fetch feed, which is where we need to just pass a URL. So let me just close that, fetch episodes. For now, that is done, because now we're kind of reacting to that. Sync podcast, create podcast, record that it was synced, that is done. Sync podcast episode is a job that we are working on. Podcast reactor we are working on. So we want to, good question, Ollie. So yeah, I've really embraced the PHP 8 with constructors. I like it. It gives me a lot of freedom to kind of describe things nicely. So when I dispatch this, I want to get the podcast UUID. What have I got on that event? Let's go back and look at that event quickly. So yeah, it just allows me to be, really clean with how I'm doing things. So that aggregate UUID is that is coming from the aggregate, I believe. So on the console commands fetch, passing through the podcast to the sync podcast, which we pass through that to there. So on our reactor, the event should have podcast ID on it. So when we are saying sync, we want the podcast ID and the feed URL. So if we'll just have to store the entire podcast, unfortunately, I think. To store that podcast was synced, podcast, blah, 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 lots of magic, cool. There, in the reactor, now our event should have that entire podcast on it. Yeah, sorry, it just lets you be a lot more declarative, Ollie, to be honest. You can write a really nice API. So, I can pass through event if I'm calling that method, and it's keyed really nicely. So drop that, uncomment that, let's import it. Let's go have a look. So we need to pass through the ID and the feed URL. So the event podcast ID, the only thing is I can't pass it through here. So on dispatch, because it's hidden behind magic, it's a bit of a pain, but it could be worse. So event podcast ID and event podcast something or other, feed URL. So that is how we're reacting. We're just dispatching a job. Okay, podcast was synced, dispatch this job. Here's the ID, here's a feed URL. For each podcast, we're just going to ping off all of these jobs. And then within here, we're just going to handle it. So public function, handle, do stuff. And the bonus is, because we're doing this through an aggregate here, we're doing this through a synced podcast. We can react to the podcast was synced. And we can say, great, if you've subscribed, we're going to update you and say there's new podcasts. Because all we're going to do here when we handle is if we just close that down, we need that one. Reactor we don't need that one. Getting the feed, channel, get the feed. Great. So fetch feed from the feed URL. Done. We've now got the data. We don't need to do anything with the podcast. We need to maybe update that. I think. Yeah, we should do. String UID model. Models concerns has a UID. No, it should be fine. That should now be fine. That should still be fine. Cool. So we're updating, then we're going to go through this and just do stuff. Just do stuff. So let's grab that, drop that in, and let's just kind of look through it. So we've fetched our feed. This is an action we created earlier, which is going to build up the response the way we want it every time. If we failed, we're going to throw the exception straight away. We're going to cast the feed to an array, and then we're going to get the channel out of it and just return that, which means that we've got our channel straight away. Then we're going to create some episodes. Then for each item within the channel, we're going to grab all of the data we want and push it all to this nice episodes array. We could probably move that to an action at some point, which we probably will do, but right now I won't overcomplicate that because I've been on for a while. So now we've got episodes. I can say, we can do something like collect episodes, and then we want to map over each episode. But we also want to use, oh no, I shouldn't have to do a use because I can pull in the scope. So let's just do a nice dime dump on that episode. So if I now sync, we're getting errors. Hey, what did I do? Catalog carbon is not here. That's fine. I can allow carbon into the party, can't I? Right. So we've got this. We've got our part of the array, and we can kind of look this up based on the external ID, which was one of the reasons we wanted to store it. So that means we can come back to here. We are on episodes, aggregate, actions, events, jobs, reactors, models, builders, episode. So we can do a lookup on our episodes. Let's make sure it's on our episodes. External ID, perfect. Public function external string ID. We're going to return ourselves. This is just creating a scope. We can say this return this where the column of external ID is equal to the value of the ID we just passed in. So we can trim that down really quickly. So we can say for each episode that we are pulling back from the array, let's see if it exists. We can do a episode first or create, where the first part of it is the external ID and external ID. There we go. So we're either going to grab it first or create. I think that's what we're after. Or is that what we want? No, we're not going to do a first or create on this one. We're just going to do an episode external first. Then we're going to get stored that. So that external is going to be an ID of episode external ID. Let's just pull that in, drop this down, and then just dump out stored as well as the array. And let's see how that looks. So here is that null. We are not getting anything back. So is it a problem with this? Is it a problem with that? Let's drop that part and let's just say where the external ID is episode external ID. We're getting it. So there's something wrong with that scope, which we will look at a little bit later, where the column is external ID and the value is episode. So what we can do is, if we don't have an episode, we can do like we could like create it. Probably got that somewhere. Create episodes, episode created, blah, 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 reactors down here. Reactor, dispatching stuff. Oh my God, it's everywhere. There's stuff everywhere. Yeah, wow, there's literally stuff everywhere. Which bit was I doing? Okay, so if there's no episode, then we will just do something like an episode create. So let's have a look for that. Sync podcast. Here we go. So let's just grab that for now. Similar. Horrible, I know. So the UUID, we don't, that's where that's going in wrong. That's tying back to the aggregate though, so I'm going to keep that like that for now. This is where we need to create. Okay, no, if there's no episode, we need to do something different. Maybe trigger off, trigger aggregate. And at that point, we're just going to return. But if we do have one, we're going to get stored and we're just going to update it. So if it's new, we'll do something else to update it. But if we're updating, we will just do, you know, something like this. Pull that back, don't need the UUID. So we got title, description, author, external URL, media, published that under podcast ID, and I should have a podcast ID on here, not on the event. So I can just say this podcast ID, which means that the next time our good friend Eric over at PHPUgly publishes an episode, we can just kind of run this command and we should get it. So let's say this one. Let's just delete that row. Great. So we're now out of sync. So this is where we can figure it out. Quarter. Okay, so okay, my bad. Stored. If we don't have stored, we'll do that. My bad. Silly Steve. Right, so now we're looking for 239. It's most likely to be at the bottom now, which is fine. Is it going to be there? 239 are there. We do have 239. Let's sort by title. Scroll all the way to the top. Reload. Gimme. Oh no, because we're not, we didn't do it. We got to trigger the aggregate, haven't we? Steve, what are you doing? Okay, so this is where we need to go for. Drop all of those. Aggregate, aggregate, create episode, podcast ID and episodes. Right. So it's not stored, so we need to go for the episode aggregate root. Retrieve. Create a new UUID. Say to string, so that when we retrieve, we can say that the UUID is this, and that we want to create episodes, and we're going to podcast ID is this podcast ID. Episodes is going to be okay. If we do have one stored, we'll do this. If we don't, we're going to do this. We'll do it the other way around. Just to make it a little bit nicer. So be in here, if we do have this particular one stored, we can do something magic. We've collected, haven't we? Balls. We're not really utilizing the collection though, so we'll do a for each. Instead of a map, just make sure I find the right one at the bottom. Move that up there. And if we've got it stored, we're going to do this. And if we don't have it stored, we're going to do this instead. Perfect. So now we can say, okay, so if it is stored, we'll store it. Can I do index episode? Can I dump out the index, and will the episode look the way I want it to? Bam, bam, bam. Okay, so got the episodes okay. Can I just dump out? Can I get the episode, not the episodes? I can. Can you hear me now? There we go, that got better, didn't it? Oh, that was painful. Right, I'll finish this up. So, where were we? Where did we get to? Thinking. Something to do with the UID. Didn't like the UID. Podcast reactor line 31. Let's trace this one back a little bit now that I've fixed that audio issue. Yeah, it was a wife's idea. The only downside is you might hear my keyboard a bit louder, but we'll see. We shall see. Right, where are we getting this aggregate root from? We're complaining about called undefined method string. Just not calling anything string there. Dispatching reactor. Let's do a quick try and dump on the event there. We get the podcast and we get the feed URL. ID, feed URL. Great, that is expected. So when we dispatch this, we got the podcast and the feed URL. UID. There's a UID, so let's quickly sort this. We know that bit's working. handle all of this bit's magic. Doing some fixy, sorty on that one. Then stored, getting that. Update, which we're passing. To string. It was that simple. Yes, you are, wifey. You're full of great ideas. Right, okay, so now we're dying and dumping on summon somewhere. Have to think. Doing magic in the background, is it going to behave? Podcast, and let's go to the episodes. It's still not loading in there, so let's have a quick look back through syncing here. Let's open up Ray. Let's see what Ray's going to tell us. Let's drop this down so it's not full screen, so you can see our good friend Ray. See if it's going to do anything. Null. Cool. So it's saying no, basically. So we're trying to do a lot more than what we need to be doing. So for each episode as an index episode, let's just do a Ray and die. Let's stick it in Ray because it'll be nice. So we got this. So we can get that external ID. That is what we're expecting. And say external first. Let's see if our helper works. Is null. Okay, so before we do that one, we'll do array episode where the external ID is this one. We'll just do a get instead. Still none. So that first one doesn't exist, which is great. Drop that. Okay. None. Ooh, one. So that first one works. Second one fails. Now let's test it. We're just getting the first. Failed, got one. Perfect. That is what we wanted. That's exactly what I was expecting to happen in the first place. So let's grab that. Let's do it again. So now we can go to our database, and this should now have 139 apparently. Apparently not. I don't know why that's not displaying. Whoa. Keeps reacting. Turn that off for now. Right, great episode. Move Ray out of the way. So for each episode, and unset if it's stored to that. Otherwise, we can actually move this outside of that loop because we don't want it to run for each time. Let's just right, so now it's going to complain about something else. UID. Episodes. Great. Database. Have I just not had enough sleep? Am I just tired? I think I might just be tired because that's just being strange. Right, tell you what we'll do. We will migrate fresh and seed. Let's just stick everything back in where it's meant to be. We'll close down Ray for now because we don't want it. So now our database got one podcast, all of them. And what I'm going to do is actually select them all, and we'll just select those ones. So we've only got 4 episodes now. Something went wrong. 4 episodes there. What happens if we sync now? Ooh, that is worrying. There should be something is not lining up. I think it could be. Could it be the reactor? Are we reacting to it, or do we need to do something else? Podcast reactor. Podcast created on podcast synced. Is our event being stored in the database? Yeah, we're storing it, and we're storing podcast. Podcast was synced. Events. Store on the podcast. I think I've just had a long day, so I'm not sure what's gone wrong. That's all I can think of. Sync the podcasts. And we're going to dispatch a job. Sync podcast episodes. Okay, we'll try a different way. We'll say episode create, and we'll refactor to something a bit more complicated later on. Create episodes, which is going to record that, blah, 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 blah. Then we're going to react. We can do something, and this part here. We're just going to grab that for now. So we're just going to create exactly what we just did. Drop that instead. Let's see if this is going to fix our issues. New IDG string. Make sure we're not missing anything. Podcast ID, that's been got. Right, there's only one way to tell. Cast async, go. Okay, so that is not what I expected. Let's do a quick for everything else, and we'll just move that with it there. Took a bit longer. We got one. Got that index because we're not too bothered, because we're just going to do it all within one. For each episode is episode. If it's stored to that, otherwise do that. Why is it only adding one at a time? Oh, that's events, no wonder. Silly Steve. We got them all back. Right, let's just right, episodes. We got all of our episodes back. Great, so it does work. So then if we just delete them all for some random reason, let's say something goes horribly wrong with the admin UI, we get them all back. Perfect. That kind of works. And for now, we only get the one because we're syncing. We will just commit that. We'll say episode 3, and we're with podcast episode sync command. And that is me calling it a night. I think it's 20 past 10. I've been going since 7:45. It's a good 2 hours-ish. So I shall catch you all next time. Thank you very much.